As a sibling separated from 7 of my very close brothers and sisters who I have known for all my life until about 10 years ago, I was introduced to a whole new experience of how to communicate with victims of child abuse in foster care. Having normal conversations about things that we like to do together before the separation was an impossible task, because I noticed that every time I would mention something that we used to like, it was like a horrible shock to my siblings. And I realized that those shocks happened because it reminded them of the family that they no longer had, that they were under a lot of pressure not to remember those things. And so I began to understand that their minds had been manipulated to dehumanize their life experience. And I devised a way on how to communicate with my siblings. And the way I go about it is such that it has to be a very methodical treatment of communication. It's not an ordinary conversation between brother and sister or sister and sister. And just because I have experience as a freelance journalist, as someone who likes to engage in academic discussions, someone who understands common fallacies that are inserted into debates when it comes to academic topics, I was able to create a program on how to communicate with my siblings, and I'm going to share it with you today. The method that I want to discuss is in itself evidence of the program, the knowledgeable behavior, the knowledgeable imprint that the CPS workers have used on my family in order to make sure that they continue to receive benefits by creating mental illness in the family. And a couple days ago I learned that these methods are actually DSM-5 conditions that are recognized by psychologists, and it is a form of child abuse. Today I'm going to show you how I decoded the situation. So when I talk to my brothers and sisters, what I do is I avoid anything that could be associated with our prior lives. And I choose topics that I believe are completely unrelated to a prior life experience. More specifically, I think about all the ways that someone who, in an extremely acute observation of our family life for years and years and years, if they were going to think of infiltrating my family, how would they go about it? What things would they use? how would they know when to poison us or hurt us? How would they know what time we go to bed, or what time we wake up in the morning, or what time we eat, what things we eat? All of these things that someone would know about the family, about our activities, about our habits. I think about them and I avoid them 100%. Then I come up with ideas and topics that I believe are not going to be expected by someone who has been constantly observing my family. And I communicate with my siblings about those distant topics. So in order for me to communicate, I'm actually not thinking of the interests of my siblings. I'm thinking of the interests of people who alienated my siblings and how they would interfere with our communication, even though they're not present. So it's a very painful method that I have to practice, and this is the only way that I can communicate with my siblings who are still under the manipulation. This is the only way that I can even get a response, because otherwise, if I don't take into account the presence of those foreign influencers, there's no way for me to get across. It's impossible. Now, having a communication with my family is an objective that is worthy as a human being. However, when I'm having these very complex communications with my siblings, I notice that when I have talked to them, they mention things that I don't expect either, such as terrorism, subversive behavior against the government, very outlandish communications that have absolutely nothing to do with sibling interaction. It's very shocking. It's like we would be talking about what kind of food is good, and they're like, oh, you like that because that's what the Chinese like to do. Let's say, what does this have to do with our family life? It's completely unrelated. It's completely beyond what I want to reach. So this made me understand that the objective that those people had who were dealing with my siblings was something much further beyond the topic of family neglect or unhappy childhood or anything that has to do with human interactions or social services. Suddenly I was put into the world of 9/11. My siblings were taken away in 2004. That's 3 years after 9/11. And it seems like a lot of people who were around my siblings were very much into the terrorism debate. And so that caused me to look past just avoiding controversial topics that could be triggers about family life in the past, and to think about other objectives that were beyond the sphere of family life, that involved international affairs that involved national security. And that as I began to listen to these topics that my siblings would mention were actually related to subversive behaviors by the CPS workers. So, as to cover their intents for their involvement with my family. Supposedly they're just for child care, but in reality they are trying to use topics that are normally associated at the federal level in order to garner the favor of federal officials that may be interested in the case because of other unscrupulous behavior with regard to the child's care. Now, this is very bizarre, and what I'm about to show you is a diagram that I came up with and that really made me feel concerned about the state of affairs with some groups of people who are actually engaged in subversive behaviors in the United States against the U.S. government. And so I'm going to show you a diagram. This is a very amateur video, as you can tell. It basically goes like this. It's a triangulation. So we have the child, and then we have the CPS worker. Now, the CPS worker has these other objectives. They're subversive objectives that have to do with continuing the involvement of CPS in the family, continuing to destabilize the family or the child after they reach maturity, and even destabilizing the government of the state so that they continue to be protected from scrutiny by the state or by the federal government. So these are hidden objectives that we can't really pinpoint as far as what they could be. They could be an attack, like a death threat, which we've received in the past couple days, or it could be a physical attack on the family. It could be burning the house down. It could be assassinating a government official. It could be anything. We don't know what those are. But the CPS worker uses their relationship to the child and the interest of the biological family to create a triangulation where this is the biological family here who wants to reach the child in foster care, and the biological family has these topics, and it causes an emotional trigger in the child, and that emotional trigger triangulates to one of these objectives. Now, when you want to have an actual communication with your sibling who's been in foster care, you have to make sure that you don't talk about anything that you could remember comes from your family life. You actually have to choose outlandish topics. Outlandish meaning, if you grew on a farm, then you want to talk about the city. If you grew up in the city, you want to talk about being on the farm. That way, these social workers have no way to use a child in this triangulation. So if you choose topics that the social workers are not expecting for you to talk about, then what happens is that the child bounces the emotional reaction off and back to the social worker. The child begins to scrutinize any relationships that the social worker could be using to push them into human trafficking, to coerce them into taking poisonous medications, to coerce them into violent behaviors against their family, or into hurting themselves. So normally what people do is completely ignore this relationship because they don't know it exists. And it usually looks like this, where in the mind of the biological family, there's a communication like this to the biological child or sibling, and from the biological sibling back to their home family, their actual family. But this doesn't exist. Once the child has been alienated from their family, once a person has been alienated from their family, there is no back and forth communication. The only communication that you are having is with the CPS workers, because they've created a new identity for the child. When the child under the influence of the CPS workers are using this triangulation system of alienation, when the child is under that, you may think that you are arriving at a certain achievement in communication, but all that's really happening is that the CPS is using the child to learn your behaviors so as to insulate the child's mind, or the adult's mind even, because these influences continue far into adulthood until the person is normalized. So you may think that just by hanging out with the person, you are getting to know them, they're getting to know you. That's not true. There is no communication. Instead of a triangulation, you may think that you are reaching a goal, but what's happening is that there's a huge disconnect. There is no connection between you and the child. It's just an empty space here. Okay? So the objective when faced with the triangulation is to break the relationship between the victim of foster care abuse and these objectives. as long as the child is using his or her independent and free thinking to evaluate his or her surroundings and the influences that she's around, then he or she is going to start thinking on their own, and they're going to start checking the foster parents or those foster influences. If that relationship, if the communication that you're having with your sibling or your child is not having that bounce back effect, since this child mostly knows most of their environment is in the foster home, if it's not having that bounce back effect to the fosters, then there is no communication. A person should always be self-aware, and the objective of social services should never be to take away the free will and social awareness of an individual. These unsuspecting items here that we were talking about earlier, they can be both positive and negative. In other words, they can cause a positive reaction, let's say a happy thought, such as, we're going to have a bowl of pasta. They could be an angry thought, like, this pasta tastes horrible. It really doesn't matter what those unusual topics are, as long as it's related to something that is not from your previous family life, because these people grill children very heavily, and they prevent them from associating anything that happened in their prior life with anything positive. So you have to be careful that whether it creates a happy thought or a negative thought, that it has nothing to do with their prior life. These other triggers that the social worker introduces themselves have to do with both positive and negative stimuli. So they could say that their biological family was a great family, but that just they weren't able to take care of them, for example. They could say that the biological family died. They could say that it could be anything that is an actual experience from their previous life, positive or negative, that has to be avoided. So, using this understanding of the effects of the foster CPS alienation communication, I was able to reach my siblings. So that's just a very crude diagram that I made, and I just wanted to explain how these CPS workers are very well experienced in human intelligence. Some of them, although they have very low degrees, but there's a few, like Jim McComb and Diane McComb, who have been working with mental patients, psychotropic drugs and their effects, electroshock therapy, and everything that has to do with all the alchemy of psychosis, psychology in the United States. So some people are extremely sensitive to all of the causes and effects of behavioral habits, and they are using this information that they have from their many years of experience to manipulate the children in child protective services, to control them far beyond the legal age of guardianship, and even to target the families after the child exits from the CPS situation. They send them back to the family to get more information, to continue to persecute the family, to find out information about the family's life in the future, so that they can perhaps target the children of other family members who have not yet been in the CPS system. So just the fact that I have siblings who have been in CPS, they're targeting me. They want to destabilize my family life through my siblings by coming to me with death threats and all kinds of accusations. It's very delicate situation. At the same time, I can't bear to see my siblings be constantly victimized, and when they ask for my help, I feel very compelled to speak to them, but I have to be very careful about what I say. So anyway, this is a video, and I hope it's understandable to some degree.